Welcome to the Voices of War, a podcast with a simple vision to bring to life the true costs of war through the voices of those who've lived it. I'm your host Maz, and I hope you enjoy this episode. Today, I continue with my coverage of the situation in Afghanistan, as I feel that it will have significant security implications, not only in the region, but potentially also for the rest of the world. However, for my audience waiting for a return to more diverse topics, I assure you that I have many interesting and insightful conversations in the pipeline. On that note, I will shortly be releasing my conversation with Lieutenant Colonel Dave Grossman, the author of On Killing and On Combat, that I recorded last week. Until then, back to the situation in Afghanistan. Today I'm speaking with Dr. Mike Martin and Dr. Christopher Ankersen. I've spoken with Mike a few times before and will link to our previous episodes in the show notes. Suffice to say that he is considered an expert on Afghanistan and is the author of the book An Intimate War, considered by many as the most authoritative book on the political, social and economic dynamics of Afghanistan. Dr. Christopher Ankersen is an associate professor at the Center for Global Affairs at New York University. Prior to joining NYU, he enjoyed a colourful and eclectic career, which includes being a security advisor for the UN, as well as serving in the Canadian Armed Forces for more than a decade. Throughout his career, he has taught at the London School of Economics, the London Centre for International Relations, King's College London, Carleton University, and the Royal Military College of Canada. He has also lectured at staff colleges in Canada, Australia, and Denmark. I'll also provide a link to Chris's full bio in the notes. Mike and Chris joined me today on Saturday, 28th of August, and it's approaching just shy of 5 a.m. in Kabul, to discuss the ongoing situation in Afghanistan and its implications for the region and beyond. Mike remains in Fiji and Chris is in New York City. Gentlemen, thank you both for joining me.
Thanks, mate.
Mike, maybe I can start with you and probably with a broader question, but particularly what is happening on the ground at the moment. And I note that the airport security has just been handed over to Taliban. What are you hearing?
As you said, there's about 3 hours ago, the first Taliban units took over a bit of the airport in Kabul. Most of the countries, in fact, every country except the US, has folded their evacuation operations, and everyone's got out. I don't think there are very many UK troops left. And they're the second biggest contingent after the Americans, and then the Americans will be progressively over the next couple of days handing over to the Taliban. And I know that the 31st was the deadline, but the reality is when you've got to try and get all the people who are out in the airport, as well as 5,000 US Marines and all the sensitive equipment and whatnot, then the reality is you need to start doing that several days earlier.
Yeah.
More broadly in Kabul, we got a bit of a patchwork going on. Obviously, 2 weeks ago now, almost. I mean, it was Sunday the 15th when the Afghan government collapsed, and then the surrounding Taliban units moved into Kabul to assume the security of Kabul. On a governance level, nothing much has happened. Like, there's no ministers announced. We don't, there's no government been formed. There's a complete vacuum. Technically, the president of Afghanistan is Saleh, who's sitting up in Panjshir, and I know we're going to touch on that later. Who was the vice president, and because Ghani fled, he automatically becomes the president. And on the ground level, we've got quite a lot of jostling between different Talib factions to get those ministerial positions. We've had movements of Helmanis and Kandaharis up to Kabul, and they've just sort of occupied the finance ministry. And this is how you negotiate in Afghanistan. You turn up and you occupy a ministry. And then, the checkpoints around the airport has been, people have reported lots of different responses. And the reason they've got that is because it's actually different checkpoints in Kabul are controlled by different factions. So, I think there's a number of questions that I guess we're going to go into, but like, how much does the political Talibs who are saying all these nice things control the on-the-ground Talibs? How much unity is there between different Taliban military factions?
Yeah. I think these are useful, useful questions. And I think we may, why don't we go down those questions? I think they're set the context quite well, and they're very important questions. So where are we? What is the relationship in your view? And then maybe we'll go across to Chris as well from your perspective.
I mean, I think there's a big, first and foremost, there's a generational gap between the political layer of Talibs, who are mostly from the first government. And, Barada was like a co-founder of the Taliban, right? And most of the people fighting on the ground who are kind of young hotheads, many of whom will have been born after 9/11, right? And then in between, you've got these, in between the different military factions, you've got these big handfuls of, you got the Haqqani group, who are sort of based over in Paktika, or Loya Paktia. And then you've got sort of Helmandis and Kandaharis who are more linked to Quetta. And then you've got some of those guys are also linked to Iran. And then up in the north, you've got the Taliban groups around Mazar and Tajikistan that were kind of, a lot of them are sponsored by Russia. And then, you got Badakshi Talibs, so all these sort of local different groups of Talibs. And really, I guess the key point is the Taliban weren't expecting to win. But certainly not now. And that's so suddenly they've had to, so they built a kind of district level governance structure, sort of had a provincial, they had a shadow provincial governor stuff. So they had that in place. And those shadow provincial governors just moved across and become governors of their provinces, right? That they were shadows of before. But they had nothing, they had no prep whatsoever for national government. And all of a sudden they're in charge, and all of them are going, well, hang on, I want to be the Minister of Finance. I don't know, Chris probably got sort of another view on that as well.
No, I think that element of surprise is probably, many people are surprised that they were surprised, but the speed with which they were able to achieve what they did was very much unexpected by them as well. And to that extent, I think it's interesting to see this bottom up approach. As you say, things are actually more normal and regular as to how they're going to do business at the district, kind of village and provincial level. But when you get to not only the composition of the government, but even the policies, we've seen now kind of drips and drabs coming out about what can be done, what can women expect, for example. We've heard conversations with Abdullah. We've heard conversations with Karzai as a way of trying to, really form this kind of at speed while everyone else is kind of waiting around. I know rather impatiently to kind of see what this government's going to be like. And in the meantime, very interestingly, the first foreigners kind of to re-enter the country and actually get a visa with the new the Taliban imprimatur were from the Médecins Sans Frontières, and the business of the country will now continue. And like it or not, many people don't want to. We'll talk about recognition, I think, of the Taliban, de jure, but de facto they're running the country, despite the fact that they don't seem to even have their own kind of ducks in a row yet. So it is very much an uncertain time. Very much not even necessarily. Rhetoric hasn't kind of even been put out there, and now we're trying to put the pieces together. It's very much making it up as they go along, as they need to, in terms of dealing with these kinds of internal negotiations, as you've said, Mike. So rather than coming out with a clear agenda and then filling in who's who in the zoo, it's almost, well, the agenda depends on who it is, and who it is depends on the agenda. So it will be, I think, opaque until that process kind of breaks the surface and we see who it is.
Who's gonna? Yeah, because I speak to Talib, or I speak to people who speak to Talibs inside the movement. It's just complete chaos about what they're going to do and what the policies are and who's in charge and all that kind of stuff. Chris, who do you reckon's going to? What's the sponsorship? What countries are going to recognise them? The Afghan government's a rentier state. Who's going to pay for who's going to sponsor this government? Like, what do you reckon?
Yeah, I think it's going to be everybody's going to sponsor them, or again, they're going to sponsor their team within the Super Bowl that is going to be the Taliban government, right? So the states, regional actors have interests, clearly. Keep extremists out, worry about drug trafficking, keeping sympathetic extremist groups in their home countries from kind of linking up. exploiting mineral resources and other kind of domestic commercial resources such that they will be. So there's going to be lots of opportunities for countries to get in there. And again, it's not rocket science to figure out who they're going to be. Clearly, Pakistan will be there, Iran, India, Russia, the Central Asian republics, as well as China. And what will be interesting is a lot of those sponsors, not only will they be backing individual aspects of the Taliban, they themselves will be competing. So, I mean, again, the word great game is one of these kind of cliches by now, but again, we will see a competition of these various sponsors who also don't agree on what they want to get out of it, backing different aspects of the Taliban who also don't necessarily agree. I think in some sense, for now, a unifying, if that's the right word, or at least a focal point, will be this problem of dealing with Islamic State. I know Mike's got stuff to say about whether or not we can really parse those apart, but I think the feeling is that there's going to be a terrorist problem, an extremist problem, and it needs to be dealt with. And therefore, I think many countries will see the Taliban as the horse to back in that fight. So I think, surprisingly to many, I think they will get either de facto or de jure recognition and sponsorship in spades, as a matter of fact.
So just to kind of round up on that for a little bit, because that's a really interesting point to go from. But just to recap very, very quickly, the key point you're making is that at the moment there's still a very kind of fragmented Taliban leadership cohesion, and that is still being morphed and it's forming, and we still don't have any kind of government to speak of, and it's very much the control is still kept at the local level. To what extent do you think there is a wedge that exists between the kind of provincial, regional Taliban commanders and the senior level? Because if we still don't have that cohesion, we're not. It strikes me as though we're not there yet to be talking about supporting or legitimizing a Taliban, whoever ends up leading the Taliban. I guess we're not there yet. What's your thoughts? Is there a wedge there that's still being potentially exploited? And that's where this kind of ISIS threat can also splinter even further the movement, so to speak.
Well, I think fragmentation, and I'll leave it to Mike to talk a little bit about exactly the flavors of that fragmentation, which I think it is the key word. I don't agree that the countries will wait to see who's in charge. They will be backing their own horses already. Yeah. And in some senses, they may well back their own. They may well be backing their own lower level faction and backing a different faction whenever the real Taliban, as a government, don't expect people to be rational or unified. They will try to pull on whatever lever they can in order to meet their own individual interests, which can be, antagonistic to this idea that let's let the dust settle. Let's wait for things to kind of, become normalized. That's not necessarily the kind of forces that are acting on this thing.
There are countries already reacting, I guess. Is that they're not there's no tactical.
They're not waiting around.
Yeah, no, that's right. They're already in there. Yeah. Sorry, Mike, you were about to jump in as well.
Well, I was just going to say the problem is we've got to look at how outsiders understand Afghanistan. Predominantly, they understand Afghanistan through they like to draw categories, right? It's a horrendously complicated country, right? So outsiders love to draw categories around groups of militants, right? And so we talk about IS and we talk about the Taliban, right? Nobody's talking in the media about all the different factions of the Taliban, but they are a massive, as we've just been discussing, they're a huge part of this. Then what else do we have? Well, then from the Chinese point of view, they're really interested in Uyghurs, right? That's their big thing, right? And the political Taliban leadership about 2 weeks before they took when Barada went to go and see the foreign minister in China, Taliban released a statement that the Uyghurs were an internal problem for China to deal with. Well, that will probably come as news to the Uyghurs and their Taliban brethren who are fighting or were fighting so recently in Badakhshan province, right? So these outsiders, whether you're Chinese or American or probably Russian as well, or have less visibility of kind of the exact intricacies of their sponsorship, have drawn boxes around different groups of Afghans, right? In order to channel funding, in order to achieve, outcomes, And the question is, are those the right boxes? So let's look at it from the American perspective, right? They're going, well, and we can sort of see this already. In fact, it's been happening for a couple of years in certain parts of Afghanistan. They're working with the Taliban to fight IS. Okay. Well, the thing is, like, if I think about that particular, the Taliban and IS and also the Haqqanis, right? So the Haqqanis are a big faction within the Taliban. They were originally a group that rose up. The head of the franchise, now dead, but Jalaluddin Haqqani was a big guerrilla fighter against the Russians. They rode out in the jihad. And then they kind of joined the Talibs much more recently and became a major faction. But Siraj, who's now taken over the mantle from Jalaluddin, has become one of the deputy leaders, one of the 3 deputies of the Taliban, right? So technically they're integrated, but in reality, it's Afghanistan. So the Haqqanis are looking after the Haqqanis, the Helmanis are looking after the Helmanis, all the rest of it. And now where IS are, where their kind of area is in Afghanistan, is over in basically in the Haqqani area, right? So what if you draw a Venn diagram, you could draw 3 circles on it with like the overlap with Taliban, Haqqani network and IS, and there would be movement between the two. A lot of the IS guys were actually Talib guys who just defected or switched sides, right? And of the IS guys that I'm really familiar with, the ones in Helmand, there was a brief sort of flash of IS in Helmand. Rauf, who's the IS leader in Helmand, had he must have been dizzy. He changed sides so many times over his jihadi career. Like, he started out on the government, in the communist government, and then switched about 10 billion times and eventually ended up in the Taliban and then switched to IS and then got killed by a US drone strike in like 2015 or 2016 or something. And that kind of killed off the IS faction, in inverted commas, in Helmand. But we see similar stuff, Antonio Gestosi's written a fantastic book on this, detailing the kind of emergence of IS in that Haqqani area that I detailed. And it's the same. It's side switching. It's, local stuff driving it. So the boxes that the Americans are drawing between these guys, the State Department yesterday, the spokesperson said the Haqqani and the Taliban are different things, which, the Taliban, they published their own leadership structure that says that Haqqani is one of their deputies. So just, I think they're coming at it.
But I think that's...
Sorry, Chris, go on.
No, I was just going to say, I think the main point that I take away from what you're saying, and I can fully agree, is that people are drawing their own maps. It doesn't, there's the reality, which is complicated, it's confusing, and it's ever changing. But for the sake of whatever their own national objective is, people are more comfortable creating a narrative, creating a map. And Ned Price's comments yesterday, was it misinformation, as in he doesn't know what he's saying, or was it disinformation in the sense that, okay, we're writing this map again, right? Here we go. We're going to now start saying map. Who's who.
Yeah.
But
right?
that means they
black
won't
and white.
achieve their policy objectives. That means they won't achieve their policy objectives. And sorry, just finally, when we're talking about that Venn diagram with 3 circles, of course, the 4th circle in that Venn diagram is the Pakistani ISI, so the Pakistani intelligence agencies who have sponsored the Taliban, sponsored Haqqani, and one assumes have got some dealings with IS. So, disentangle that.
Yeah, but I think that's the complexity. And I think, just to take Chris's point about the narratives, or the simple narratives, it's inevitable that there are competing narratives. There's the simple black and white that we hear, certainly in the mainstream discussions, mainstream media. But then the further you go down, the more you realize, well, hold on, it's actually not nowhere near that simple. But the problem is that we end up making decisions based on those simple narratives, which ultimately end up, contributing to the problem. Is that something that you see happening at the moment, Chris?
Absolutely, right. The cliches are everywhere, right? But as Einstein said, I would rather spend 90% of the time trying to figure out the problem than actually worry about the solution. And we are definitely not following his advice, right? yesterday in the speech that President Biden gave, very moving speech, clearly very emotional for him, this idea that vengeance is going to be, he will avenge the death of the service members that were killed, sadly just kind of starts the whole kind of narrative all over again. And people have been saying, yes, but, Americans will demand, blood. They're baying for blood, which, in some ways should make a lot of sense in the sense that it's not very different from the kind of instincts that we see in as Mike has kind of written about quite a bit. But you would hope that of anything, I mean, the 20th anniversary of this event, George Bush is out for, dead or alive, kind of, we will hunt them down, every last one of them. That's how we started this. And it looks like we thought we were going to come to the end of something, but it looks like now we might be kind of back on an upswing. And in order to act at that level of very populist kind of reaction, you need to simplify things and you need to harness your own narrative, because no one's got time or attention to listen to, people like Mike and others who actually know the intimacies. And therefore, the simple narrative that sits on top of that, the very few lines that are written with a very broad marker are what you're stuck with. So, for example, you talk about ISI. For a long time, people assumed that the Pakistani intelligence was kind of the main actor. But now, in the 20 years since we've been doing this, India is a very different country than it was 20 years ago. It wants a role on the international stage. It's very much come into its own stride as a global actor. And now we've got, the research and analysis wing, the Indian equivalent of the ISI, playing kind of, spy versus spy inside Afghanistan, looking for proxies, looking for ways to score points against their traditional foe, that happens to be happening kind of on the chessboard that is Afghanistan. So everybody seems to be, as Mike said, drawing their own lines, drawing their own scripts, playing their own game, as it were, which just means you've got layers upon layers, as if the underlying strata isn't already confusing enough. People are going to be adding their own dimensions, which at one hand simplify things, oversimplify them for themselves, but actually add to other levels of complexity. What's the relationship between China and Russia going to be inside Afghanistan, let alone what it might be outside Afghanistan?
That's a really nuanced point that I don't think resonates. It just can't resonate strongly enough, I think, because we never understood Afghanistan in the first place. Right, we went in, when I say we, the West, went into a place that we didn't really understand. As you're saying, the region has moved on from that lack of knowledge that we had. It's gone another 20 years forward. There's added complexities that are now, basically pouring fuel onto the, complexity that already existed.
Yeah. And I'm no genius, but I will bet you a large coffee that somebody in the next 2 weeks says, if you're not with us, you're against us, when they talk about all of these various countries.
But we had two boxes, right, 20 years ago that were government and Taliban, or Al Qaeda, and so it was A or B, right? And then the whole premise of the coin strategy and the surge and all this lot, all of it was based on that idea of there being an Afghan government that we're supporting to fight an insurgency. But that, as we've been discussing, it's a civil war in Afghanistan. We're entering the 44th year of that civil war. And it's going to make 50. It's probably make 60 as well. Right. And one of the reasons that happens, and the Russians did the same as well, for the Russians, it was revolutionaries versus counter-revolutionaries, or they used to call the Mujahideen Dukhi, which is ghost, Russian for ghost, because they used to appear, brass everything up and then disappear. Right. So the Russians did it. All the outsiders do it. And what ultimately it means is, if you try and impose a straitjacket onto a multifocal civil war, you won't, first and foremost, this is what I don't understand why governments do this, because it means you won't achieve your policy objectives.
What are the policy objectives? I mean, I think that's the first point that remains, but you know what I mean? It strikes me as the first point of failure, that we don't actually, I mean, all of a sudden now we're, up for revenge. And that's, it's a knee-jerk reaction.
Let me just give a quick run through of the policy objectives of the surrounding countries / the great powers, and then you'll see how much of a train wreck this is going to be. I'm sorry. I was trying not.
I saw that. I saw that. That's why I thought I'd help you.
I was going to say. Clusterfuck.
Yeah. There you go.
So Iran is interested in the southwest. Is very interested in water from the River Helmand. That's a huge issue for Iran. It's got drug trade problems. It's interested in the Shia Hazara population. Those are three of the main ones for Russia is very, very interested in militancy in Central Asian states, and they're interested in protecting what they see as their sphere of influence in the Central Asian states from militancy, but also from China, right? China is interested in minerals, it's interested in Belt and Road Initiative, and it's interested in terrorism, but it's also competing with Russia and Central Asian states. So what quite like Chris was saying, what the relationships given in Afghanistan when they've been already sparring a little bit in Central Asia. Pakistan is interested in having an allied state on its western border because it's obviously got this problem with India. And it also wants to keep China on side because China is now the main sponsor of Pakistan. India's really lost out the most from this, and they'll be interested. And they're now surrounded by either China or states friendly to China. So they will be interested in probably opening up another front in Afghanistan. I can certainly see Russia and India making common cause over what's going on in Afghanistan, and potentially there've been some rumors that the Russians have just evacuated their embassy after saying they'd stay. So the rumor is, or the supposition is, that they're now supporting the Panshiris to be a thorn in the Taliban side. Great powers. So Europe's irrelevant. UK is irrelevant. America, America could just step back and go. But I suspect that they'll want to. It's a good way of sticking it to China. What else? I mean, we could go on, but just to give you an idea of and that wasn't even going into any kind of detail. That was just off the top of my head. Here's 2 or 3 main issues that each country is interested in,
superficial layers without even going down into the actual true motivations.
And then there's 1,000 factions in Afghanistan who are all turning, we can help you with that issue.
You were nodding for most of that as well, Chris. Did you want to add something as well?
No, I completely agree. I mean, it just goes to show that, it becomes an order of magnitude more complicated than people assume. And the actors that, Mike is mentioning, were not really on anybody's radar screen when we started this off 20 years ago. As you said, it was pretty black and white, right? Now it's all the colors of the rainbow, if you want to put it that way. America had an opportunity to break, and I think that's exactly what Biden wanted, right? That's what Biden said. And I think he was very clear in making it the case that don't bother to try to wheedle me. I know what's going to happen. You guys are all going to come placating and saying, no, but boss, we can't. I think he very much put up a wall around himself and said, I will not be dissuaded. This is what's going to go. The man is not for turning, as it were. And he was going to stick with that. Breaking eggs, making omelets, all that kind of stuff. I think he was willing, as George Stephanopoulos asked him, and he responded in an interview last week. Stephanopoulos said something to the effect of, did you price the catastrophe into your decision? Did you kind of know that it was going to be bad and therefore were prepared, even if the worst case scenario happened, to accept it? And Biden said, yes, absolutely. And I think that was an honest answer at the time. He knew that otherwise, if he gave anybody an opportunity, the camel's nose would be under the tent, and there would be, but just keep another 500, 1,000, 1,500, 5,000, and we would be there forever and ever. He wanted to make a clean break, and he needed to do that. I was convinced that was the case until yesterday. And again, emotively, domestic political pressure wise, when he said, there will be vengeance. And we've already, what that means is they're not going to take that step back, whether it means there's going to be CIA and more covert operations that are there, not only looking for Americans, which will become now a myth, will become an ethos to kind of drive a lot of furthering the stab in the back theory that already exists within the United States. There's already calls, for example, domestically to impeach President Biden. So that's given fuel to that, his domestic opposition. And there will need to be some demonstrable, answer to what happened yesterday at the Abbey Gate. And that will mean that America can't even get that kind of fire break that they truly wanted with all that goes along with it.
And I suspect also the rest of certainly Australia, UK, Canada, I suspect would be jumping on that rather quickly as well, because I think there has been sufficient pressure building up, certainly in Australia and in the circles that I'm even remotely tapped in, that we should have done something, we should be doing something, this is atrocious, we shouldn't be letting our allies down, etc., etc. So there's enough pressure built up, and this potentially could be the
shoulda,
valve.
woulda, coulda. Such a shit way to do foreign policy, though.
Yeah.
Like,
but I agree. But I'm talking more from the the rank and file, so to speak. The kind of there's sufficient dissatisfaction and almost anger, not almost, definitely anger and embarrassment as to how the withdrawal has actually occurred. That might provide sufficient pressure from bottom up for our governments also to consider jumping on some sort of a response.
Well, again, I think that comment that I made earlier, that you're all going to owe me a coffee for this, if you're not with us, you're against us. That will be applied to regional governments, but that will also be applied to the League of Democracies or the English speaking world or Five Eyes or the Quad or you name it, the G7. There will be an attempt by if America does come up with a decision. I'm not going to call it a strategy, but a decision that they're going to do. Part of that will be, we don't want to get more of this on us than we can, and there will be an attempt to, I'll come out and say it, bully other like-minded countries to get on with it. And different countries will respond to that in different ways. Canada has more than 60% of its GDP with its main trade partner, the United States. So standing shoulder to shoulder is not just great loyalty to a wounded giant friend. It's also smart domestic policy. And the prime minister at the time, John Carleton, when Afghanistan kicked off, he knew very well that if he wanted to keep as we say, the Ambassador Bridge, the bridge that runs between Windsor and Detroit, that has essentially billions of dollars of trade going across it, if you want to keep that bridge open, get over to Afghanistan, essentially. So that kind of pressure, it happens in Australia. It happens in the United Kingdom. The special relationship will always need a little more buffing and polishing. And whatever that looks like, whether it's special forces dominated, whether it's intelligence services dominated, there will definitely be a push to make this more than just a unilateral response.
So what's interesting is you think the West might end up re-engaging because of all this. I think the most sensible thing that the West could do would be to go, no, we're fine now. China, you can deal with that. And it would, as we discussed in that little roundup, it would tie up China and Russia. And I'm talking in real politique terms here, right? I'm not saying that's necessarily the best thing for the Afghan people or anything like that. I'm just saying in real politique terms, Joe Biden, foreign policy expert, so self-declared, that is what you should do. That's a true kind of Henry Kissinger-esque move, right? To hand the whole thing over to China and go, there you go, your problem.
Big difference between Henry Kissinger and Joe Biden, the president, who's not Joe Biden, the vice president, not Joe Biden, the senator, but Joe Biden, the president, is he is worried about already very much domestic pressure for the midterm elections in 22. The conservatives, the Republicans are seeing this as already. Josh Hawley is saying we should impeach him on ground. They'd sent a letter to
times 10.
Kamala Harris. They sent a letter to Kamala Harris saying you need to use the 25th Amendment to remove Biden because he's passed it. How did he let this happen? So Biden, the foreign policy expert, will be having an internal fight inside his head as the leader of the Democratic Party, who doesn't want to be a one-term president, who doesn't want to be a one-term House of Representatives, who wants to hold on to, if not win, the Senate. There will be some response. Let's hope it's not completely suicidal, but there will be some response. That clear break that was the absolute reason for doing this 10 days ago has gone.
You reckon? That's really interesting.
Yeah, which gives that ISIS Khorasan. I mean, it gives them a really, an outsized impact on what's happening on the ground. But
hang
also
on, this is the whole point of
yeah.
Al Qaeda 9/11 was about sucking the US into a forever
Yeah.
war.
Yeah.
Like it's the same fucking tactic.
Yes, yeah. So, but you're the first one to
strategy.
Yeah, exactly. And you're the first one to say, Mike, as well, that war is not rational. It's it's emotional. So I think which is which is where Chris's point really stands out to me, that it seems as though it's the more likely option, especially if he publicly went and said there will be vengeance. He will be held to those words. There will be sufficient pressure on him. But this also then takes me down to the point and perhaps relevance of the quote unquote Northern Alliance, the resistance, in Panjshir Valley. Where does this sit, and how does that resistance play in this ecosystem, and what can we expect to see on the ground? Between, of course, Taliban is still trying to suppress that resistance. What are your thoughts on how credible that resistance is, and whether that is the horse that might be backed again?
Yeah, I mean, I think, look, I'm sure lots of people are having lots of conversations with people in Panjshir at the moment. But I think that, I think you've got to view this as how negotiations are conducted in Afghanistan. Afghanistan is armed politics, right? You don't come to a negotiating table without a faction of heavily armed men. And so the Panjshiris are a problem. They're a thorn in the Taliban. Let's assume for the moment that the Taliban are a unified thing. They're a thorn in the Taliban side because it stops the Taliban saying we control the entire territory of blah, firstly. And they're a thorn because territory of Afghanistan. And they're a thorn because the political people, the Doha Talebs, the Baradas of the world, are saying we want to have an inclusive government with all the different factions of Afghanistan, right? And if there's a mega armed faction holding out, then, and plus you've got the vice president de facto, in fact, de jure president, because the other one fled, in the valley. So it's hard, it makes it harder for recognition to switch and all the rest of it, right? So it's a problem for the Talebs. And that puts the Panjshiris in a great negotiating position, right? Abdullah, another Panjshiri, is sitting in Kabul, right? And he's sitting in Kabul talking to the Talibs. So I don't know what that is. That's an emissary, isn't it? Or an ambassador for the Panjshiris. And whilst we've got 15, 20, 30,000 guys, whatever it is, with light arms, maybe a bit of artillery, I've been to the Panjshir Valley. You can see immediately why Massoud managed to hold it for the entire Soviet war. Like, there's a very narrow defile that runs for a few hundred meters that you'd have to fight your way up. Impossible to take. And then
so it's really a bargaining. It's more a bargaining chip
position.
Yeah,
for sure. Yeah. Now, we've seen over the last 24 hours. There've obviously been conversations over the last week or so, 2 weeks, whatever. But we've seen over the last 24 hours that actually there have been some clashes. But they clash a bit, then they talk a bit, then they clash a bit, and violence is a mechanism of communication type thing. So there's a bit of that going on.
Well, I saw just this morning. I saw there was a clash, and one Talib, KIA, which suggests not really large scale combat, but as you said, posturing,
probing, bit of upping the ante on the talks, whatever, Fundamentally, that's a very difficult problem for the Taliban to solve militarily. And again, everyone assumes that the Taliban are amazing because they just took over Afghanistan, but it shouldn't be viewed like that. The government collapsed and the Taliban occupied the territory that the government vacated, right? And actually now they've got the Panjshiris who are serious about this. That's a much harder, tougher nut to crack. Sorry, Chris.
No, I think I completely agree with you. I think, the speed with which the Talibans, I guess we're going to call them, or whatever, moved in was essentially occupying empty squares on the chessboard. And the weight of all those empty squares made the next row of empty squares even easier to get. Well, they've got 65%, they've got 85%. It becomes a fait accompli. This is probably the first challenge of a military security problem that they've had, both now, can you actually hold Kabul? Can you actually do what you need to do? Clearly, they know that on the technical level they can't. They're asking the Turks to come in and run the airport and do all the things with, the boxes that go ping and all that stuff that whatever a technical international level airport requires. They've asked the Turks to do that, but they're going to do. They're confident, or they have been confident in what the rest of it is. Security, whether they're going to use these.
The Turks have left though, right? Sorry to just quickly interject. The Turks have actually left. Sorry, carry on.
Right. But the point is they know they need somebody to provide some levels of services, but security was something that they were fairly confident they were going to be able to do. Now it looks like Kabul is going to be a problem as well. But certainly when we're talking about Panjshir, that is, in some senses, will be the first time they've actually had to do much fighting. There was a little bit of fighting in the north, but again, we haven't really seen them tested in the field, as you say. It's been very much a blitzkrieg, not through
psychological win.
It's not been shock and awe. Yeah. This has been very much more, advancing on a crumbling edifice.
Well, and where they did have a motivated force on force thing, say down in Lashkar, so there you had, the Afghan government commandos that fought till the end, and you had a, competent general, Sami Syed, and, you had all that kind of stuff. They failed to take Lashkar. Lash was one of the last provincial capitals to fell after Kandahar, and after the leadership had been reassigned up to do the security of Kabul, and a lot of the commandos withdrawn, where they did have to go up against in a kind of force on force thing. And Lash is much easier to take geographically, in terms of topographic terms, than the Panjshir Valley is. They couldn't do it.
Yeah.
So,
I mean, and one of the things that we can't not talk about is the fact that, by some estimates, $85 billion worth of American military equipment is now in the hands of the Taliban. To what extent do you think that changes their position, in the region, for one, but certainly now in Afghanistan? Is that a significant strengthening of?
Well, I think that. Okay. So look, I've heard other figures, right? Like, the Taliban own more Black Hawk helicopters than 85% of the countries in the world, or whatever. But can the Taliban use Black Hawks?
Actually fly them?
And
that's right.
Once they've used them twice, can they then maintain the maintenance and all the rest of it? So what weaponry did the Afghan army leave behind the Taliban? Pickups and Humvees. Sure, they can use that kind of basic armored vehicle, and obviously light and medium weapons, maybe even a bit of artillery and all that kind of stuff. But it's not, they're not going to be flying I-Star and fighter jets and all the rest of it, because they don't have, that stuff's complicated. And
even if they were, I think, I completely agree with you. There's 80, whatever number you want to do, but how much of that is going to be a static display in front of, a gate somewhere as a decoration piece, and how much of it is actually usable is a completely different thing. But even if they were able to use it, let's look at it this way. If we're saying the Taliban now has to do its own counterinsurgency against ISIS-K or the boogeyman, whoever that is, technology. America had much more technology than the Taliban will inherit, and they weren't able to do it either. So, I think we have to be a little bit careful about, technological solutionism. Right? If anything, we've seen that this is much more complicated, and it goes back to what we all learned at one point that war is actually about. It's not only about body counts, bullet counts, how many aircraft you have, how many sorties you fly. It's about a combination of, can you impose your will on your adversary who's also trying to impose their will on you? That's what war is about. And whether you're talking nuclear weapons, whether you're talking about bows and arrows, it boils down to that. So we've allowed ourselves to get distracted a little bit, to fall into the same game that we've been trying to win for the last 20 years, which is, how many square kilometers do you own? How many district capitals do you own? How many road miles can you do in a week unopposed? Whatever metric we want to put on this is all just a proxy of in some senses, nonsense. And therefore, I don't think we should
humans.
Well, that's an interesting point, because I was actually going to bring in your article that you published together, which I thought was really insightful, and it speaks to that very point about the reliance on the illusion of technological superiority, which in Afghanistan certainly proved to mean absolutely nothing. right? Which is that, and that's the point you're making, Chris, as well, yeah?
Well, yeah, but I mean, again, and I don't want to abstract this too much, but I mean, it also was the case in Vietnam. And it didn't make a difference there either. As a matter of fact, the irony that very many of the same aircraft, B-52s, were involved in that as well. There's no doubt there was superiority of arms, from space-based, surveillance to laser-based target designation, you name it. From minute one of this Western involvement, there has been take your Janes off the shelf and, please yourself in front of it. You will get a very clear picture who should win. The reality is that's not enough to make a difference. And we've seen that repeatedly over and over again. We let ourselves get distracted, whether it was with Sputnik, whether it was with the missile gap, whether it was with whatever. We get so caught up in this technological dimension of it, which is an ingredient. It's certainly not an ingredient, but
it's an enabler.
It's an enabler. Mike and I mentioned this in the article that we talk about the Taliban and the Afghan National Army. But in Armenia and Azerbaijan, we've also seen a very interesting and much more nuanced relationship between old and new tech, between innovation and ways you use that tech, not just. Otherwise, it's like, just put it on the table. We'll count it all up and say, well, you're the winner, go home. I mean, that's not what we're talking about. Clearly, if that were the case, there would be very clear winners and losers, and we would just, get double S to adjudicate who wins, and we could walk away. But that's not what we're talking about. It's the human thing, right? This is about who can, as the Iron Duke said, right? The hard pounding this, who can pound the hardest for the longest. A lot of that comes into it, but psychologically as well. And we saw a technologically superior, albeit stunted in their own way because they were supported and constrained by the West. The Afghan National Security Forces had that technological advantage, and it mattered absolutely not for much. In 99% of the cases, they had other things in mind, switching sides, rolling up, listening to what was going on back in Kabul, etc. And it really didn't boil down in many cases to the bigger caliber or even the more ammunition. It was not a technologically won fight.
Yeah, survival is a fascinating motivation. Well, I think we're also probably going to bring this to a close pretty soon. Probably and a lot's been said, and I appreciate both of your insights on this. I'm going to put you both on the spot. Mike, what do you see happening in the next, in the next week or so?
In the next week, I think we'll probably see some American military strikes once they've got all their people out. I'm going to go on a limb and say I don't think we're going to see a Taliban government announced. We might do towards the end of the week. And then I think China might be the first government to recognize them. Well, Pakistan, but China will be the first great power, first Security Council power to recognize them, I think. I think that's it. And then, I think the media narrative is going to move on to the humanitarian crisis in Afghanistan.
Yeah,
which has obviously been ongoing, but
I agree with Mike. I don't necessarily think the Chinese recognition would happen in a week, but I think they will probably be the first to do so when it comes to that. I think we will see not just a media narrative, but in a large way, the international, if we want to call it that, activity will be transitioning to humanitarian aid and activity. Some of it by remote control through local implementing partners and NGOs, as we've seen already, Médecins Sans Frontières trying to come in and set up the stuff that they do, but also the UN, who in many cases have been caught as flat-footed with the announcement of the American withdrawal, as other individual countries were. And it'll be a while for them to kind of get back on level footing and figure out how is this going to be sorted out, because they're in a real dilemma right now. Their traditional donors for a lot of their development programs, not so much the humanitarian, have hinged upon the kind of Western narrative that's been at play for the last 20 years, which is human rights, expanding the franchise and the political space for women to fully participate in. Depending on how that is constrained, they will feel perhaps less generous in providing for those kinds of activities. Now, that may well be okay with the Taliban. They may say we're not going to allow those activities anyway. But I think we will see a shrinkage in how much international development and aid money will be available for Afghanistan, which will mean that while the focus is there, there won't necessarily be the largesse that we've seen in the past, because rightly or wrongly, the way that this was done at the Berlin conference in 2004, there will be a very different vibe now. No, the Bonn conference was the political side, but the Berlin conference in 2004 was really about the donors of who was going to deal with. If you remember, there was who's going to deal with drugs, who's going to deal with governance.
Absolutely.
And there was,
sorry, my mistake. I'm sorry. Yeah.
The splitting up of that. It's going to be, you're not going to get Iran and India and Pakistan and China and Russia to play an overt kind of international largesse role in the same way that Japan, who was coerced to do it by the Americans, the EU, who were, understood very well where they needed to be. It will be a very different landscape moving forward. This sovereignty first movement that, again, everybody likes to associate with Trump, has become in many ways, the leitmotif of international relations of late. We've seen it in the G7s, that we've seen it in other places. There is a recalcitrance to kind of put people's necks out there and to focus on what the people at home want, which isn't more immigration, which isn't necessarily doing the long-term kinds of development that are really going to make a difference for Afghanistan. And I think there will be several orders of magnitude, less resources than are required to address this. Somebody from UNHCR today was saying in the news, there's about 500,000 they figure was their kind of worst case scenario in terms of displaced people. In 96 to 2001, that figure of displaced people was about 7 million, I believe. There was the largest refugee population in the world at the time. And therefore, if they're kind of looking for funding at the 500,000 point, I'm not sure that even their worst case scenario is going to be big enough, nor will it be funded enough to actually address what's going to happen in the next few months.
Right. Well, it would be remiss of me not to just kind of double click on that point a little bit, because I think you're bringing up a number of really significant risks and dangers that we might see in the near future as well. And that is, of course, the humanitarian crisis. But we also can't forget those who are also trying to get out. But also the other point is that you're making is, well, where does the Taliban get finance to sustain the country if the foreign aid that they in some ways are still, I guess, and correct me if I'm wrong here, but they're still hoping to negotiate some concessions for some foreign aid. What does that look like then?
I think they'll get bilateral assistance, shall we say. China will assist them, but it won't be done through the mechanisms of the UN necessarily, is what I mean. It won't be kind of put it in the pot. So if China wants to give them money to develop Belt and Road Initiative things, which the Taliban would probably be quite happy to have roads built.
Police. Yeah.
Exactly. That will be done on a more bilateral, because it's much easier to control, right? You can turn the tap off, etc. So will India, so will Russia, so will the Central Asian republics. That's not going to meet those bigger, let's call them milieu goals of feeding people on the borders, whether they're IDPs or refugees. Yeah. It's going to be very much more focused and targeted on a bilateral basis as opposed to multilateral.
Infrastructure, China's going to go big on building roads and all that stuff. Yeah.
Gentlemen, it's been fascinating. And I think, there's many questions that you've answered. I think, we can find another 100 questions for every one of those. It's a tender time, I think, in Afghanistan at the moment. So we'll eagerly await to see how it unfolds. But I thank you both for your time, and certainly hope we can do this again, because I think you certainly provide some interesting dynamics and insights. So thank you both very much.
Thanks for having me.
Cheers, Maz.
Thanks for joining us for another episode of The Voices of War. You can access all episodes on www.thevoicesofwar.com or by subscribing wherever you get your favorite podcasts. And while you're there, please give us a review, as we'd love to hear what you think. If you'd like to recommend a guest for the show, you can reach me on info@thevoicesofwar.com.